All right, everybody, welcome into the Alley Oop. I'm your host, Ryan Blackburn. Thank you so much for tuning into the show. Really appreciate all the love and support on the podcast so far. It has been awesome. Getting some awesome growth on the YouTube channel as people start to find the videos a little bit more. It's been really, really cool to see, really interesting to experience. And if you like the video content, then make sure to go hit that like button, that subscribe button on the YouTube channel. On this episode, got the awesome Andy Bailey to talk about Nikola Jokic, other surprises and disappointments around the NBA, awards picks early, including a pretty easy MVP discussion, but also some fun discussions from around the league, too. We got into a lot of topics. The conversation runs over an hour here. It was really, really fun, and I hope you enjoy this conversation with Andy Bailey of Bleacher Report. But first, the alley-oop.
Run, 2-on-1, Green the finish. Wow, the alley-oop. Turn the corner, inside! He made Yusuf Nurkic's screensaver. Here comes Murray, alley-oop to Gordon. Oh, what a play!
All right, joined by my guy, Andy Bailey, who you may know as a Jokic truther on the old Twitter sphere. He also writes for Bleacher Reports and does some coverage of the Nuggets on the side. Andy, thank you so much for popping in, man. Really appreciate you stopping by for the alley-oop. A big-time guest for the alley-oop. I really appreciate it.
Well, I don't know about the last part of that intro, Ryan, but I'll take it. I'm excited to be here. You're always a fun face to run into at Nuggets games, so I'm happy to be here.
Thanks, man. It's always nice to run into folks that you meet online, and hopefully they don't suck. And I can assure everybody that Andy doesn't suck. He's actually like 6'7", a giant, and like extremely cool and just fun to be around. So everybody, make sure, if you don't already, Andy's a super popular guy on Twitter. So if you don't follow him, what are you doing? But make sure to go follow all of his work and read his stuff at Bleacher for sure. Andy, when I talked to you about this, and we were kind of going back and forth on different segments that we could do, the concept of early awards picks came up and surprises and disappointments came up. Let's focus on teams that are kind of surprising and disappointing, and players that are surprising and disappointing through really the early portion of the season based off of the expectations that we initially had. I'm curious where you want to go with this initially, where you want to take it.
Sure, let's start with surprises. It's a little more fun to start positive, I think, at least for me. I'm going to go with Tyrese Maxey. It's not like I figured he would be good. I figured he would have a bigger role this season with James Harden gone. I mean, that's all obvious stuff. I don't think many people could have predicted he'd be this good. We're recording this maybe 24 hours removed from the 50-point game that he just had. He's been phenomenal with the ball in his hands this season. He's up to 29 points and 7 assists per game.
Ludicrous numbers. Like those are MVP numbers, if I'm being honest. Those are crazy.
I'm glad you chimed in. I think we've gotten desensitized to bonker stat lines over the last 4 or 5 years because of the stuff we've seen from guys like Jokic and Embiid and Giannis. When I was growing up as a kid, 29 and 7 was absurd. So yeah, I'm glad you said that. He's been ridiculous, and I think the way that the Sixers play with him is sort of the lead ball handler. He's not going to be as prolific an assist man as Harden is, but I do think the ball pops a little more in general for the whole team with him in there. It's clearly working. I think I've even heard some people talking about all NBA buzz with him at this point. Forget all-star. He's probably going to do that. He's going to be in the conversation, at least if this keeps up, for all NBA, whether it's third team or whatever. He's off to an absurd start. And I knew he'd be good. I can't imagine anybody thought quite this level.
I mean, this is craziness in his fourth season. This was, I think, beyond what anybody realistically expected from a guy who was a clearly a good guard, a nearly borderline all-star caliber guard last year. But it kind of, I think, undersold him. The role that he was playing next to James Harden as clearly a secondary ball handler, the tertiary option in an offense that featured Harden and Embiid, And the Sixers as a whole are on my team of surprises. Like they are fantastic to begin this season. They have a strong case to be the best team in the NBA through 10 games. And I feel pretty strongly that the moves that they've made with Nick Nurse, with Joel Embiid kind of speeding up his decision making and just playing a little bit more with pace, and then some of the moves that they've had have been great. But the catalyst is, of course, Maxey and maybe some positive vibes that have come from Maxey being there and Harden not.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And as you were talking, I think obviously the big three had its heyday and probably will again at some point. But I think sort of intuitively, I've always been more drawn to the 2-star model. That's obviously what they had with Shaq and Kobe. That's what they had with Jordan and Pippen. That's what just won the title with Jokic and Murray. If you've got two superstars and a bunch of guys who buy into smaller roles, I think it's a little bit easier to play like sort of the team ball, beautiful ball and player movement type of style that I prefer to watch. And that's certainly not what the Sixers played last year. It was just constant spamming of the Harden Embiid 2-man game, which was effective, but it just wasn't the most enjoyable brand of basketball to watch. And I think the game has really opened up for all those guys, including Embiid. I was just looking at his numbers, and they're typically absurd too. But he's also doing a lot more passing than he has in years past. Like, he's more involved as a playmaker. And I think if you get everybody involved in both of those facets of the offense, not just a scorer, not just a playmaker, you let everybody do a little bit of both. It's just more enjoyable for me to watch.
I don't want to keep berating Harden because that comes later. But I do think that when it is easier to pass as a guy like Embiid if guys actually move off the ball. It just is. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things that I didn't really fully appreciate, was that having 4 guys moving off the ball as opposed to 3 makes a lot of difference when you're opening up the floor for everybody. It just it feels like a soul-sucking thing that happened when Harden eventually left, and the way that his style of play kind of manifested itself and the way that they were trying to play, it just feels lighter. It just feels quicker and faster, and it just feels more fun. And I firmly agree on the all-star, on the 3-star versus 2-star model. One of the things I brought up on a previous episode, I think, was that when you have 2 stars, there's so much more ability throughout the season to kind of insulate those 2 stars with 3 different role players at once, whether they're 2 defensive guys, 2 offensive guys, 1 of each. Like, it gives you a lot more flexibility for sure, versus when you have 3 guys. And the Sixers last year were a great example of this, where you have Harden and Maxey in the backcourt. Not exactly a stellar defensive backcourt, and they got burned by that several times because they needed those players to both be on the floor. Now, like, you can have DeAnthony Melton out there, and he's tremendous defensively. And like, you've got so many different options and combinations. And Kelly Oubre can play the 2, and he's 6'7". By the way, horrible news about Kelly Oubre came out over the weekend. Just disgusting, horrible. And like, I hope he's doing okay, and that whoever kind of did that is caught and like everything's figured out there. But like, the Sixers as a whole have been so positive that and honestly, like, that feels almost like Sixers fans can't have anything at all, because like, Kelly Oubre was just such a fantastic piece of their team, and now it just, like, that's sort of up in the air. So hopefully that is taken care of quickly.
And I agree with everything you said on that too. Your listeners may not know, but my other hat that I wear is a personal injury lawyer. So I have seen situations like that, and it just kind of makes me mad. And I almost feel bad talking about this, but they just happen to get a couple of role players who I think can kind of fill that hole left by Kelly Oubre in the James Harden trade. Nicholas Batum and Robert Covington probably aren't going to change the Sixers world, but I think it gets back to that conversation we've been having of the 2 stars and depth model. Just makes the offensive balancing act a little bit easier to strike. And like, I like the point that you made, that you can sort of protect guys defensively a little bit more in that scenario too.
And it's not like you don't have to protect Embiid a ton, but it also allows for them to play bigger guys, and it allows for him to play drop more and things like that. It's you
Right.
don't have to be as aggressive anymore. So it's interesting to think about. All right, let's move to a disappointment. I had Philly as a surprise. You had Tyrese Maxey as a surprise. Anybody on your list that you would consider disappointing?
Oh, I've got some disappointments. All right. I'm going to start with Andrew Wiggins, and I won't pretend to know what's going on with Andrew Wiggins. I know he missed a lot of time last season with personal reasons. And he for most of his time in Minnesota, he was a guy who was certainly not adored by advanced numbers. He seemed to have kind of turned the corner on that with the Warriors. But what he's doing right now falls short of anything that's happened in his career, Minnesota or Golden State. Like he's averaging 10.5 points, shooting 15% from three.
Yeah,
Like,
I just looked up his numbers here and nearly had a heart attack. Like that is
it's crazy.
Holy cow! Like that is
One
as
assist.
strong of a fall off as I've ever seen from a guy.
One of the things that made him so valuable in their title run a couple years ago was how well he rebounded and how well he defended. Right now, he's averaging 3.7 rebounds. He's just having like little to no positive impact on the Warriors right now, and you could almost expand this discussion to be like every non-Curry Warrior.
Yeah.
Draymond's had his moments as like a defender and playmaker, which he always will. But I'm sure you've seen the stat that keeps floating around. The only other guy that's got a 20-point game for them this season is Dario Saric.
Yes.
Other than Curry. I mean, that goes without saying.
Man,
like they're going to have to get something from somebody soon, or they're just not going to be in that Western Conference contenders tier. I'm not sure that tier is going to be as difficult to crack as I thought it would before the season. I feel like the amount of parity in the West is just like off the charts right now. So, I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if they went on a run here pretty soon and guys like Wiggins and Thompson get hot. But right now, it's got to be at least a little concerning.
Yeah, I mean, going back to Wiggins, a 6.9 PER, a
Crazy.
minus 8.4 box plus minus
which is impossible.
I mean, that's impossibly low. I don't think I've ever seen anything that low from a guy that plays significant minutes.
Yeah.
I mean, stuff like this will normalize, obviously. Like, this is why early season surprises and disappointments, like, we're going to take all these with a grain of salt, of course, because things could change in the next 10 games. But, I mean, that is a reason to have some skepticism about the Warriors in general. I thought that they would be a team that could really challenge for a top 3 seed this year. And to be clear, they still might, like you said. But it is harder to do that when many people thought Andrew Wiggins was their second best player, at least on some lists.
I never bought into that, but there were certainly people who did. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the other thing I was thinking about the Warriors, this is kind of tangential now, but they're just kind of old at this point too. And I feel like a lot of people glossed over that over the offseason and the semi-hot start that they had 4 or 5 games ago. All those guys are like those core players are all in their mid-30s. Obviously, Wiggins is a little bit younger, but they're relying heavily on guys that are post-prime. In Chris Paul's case, like way post-prime. And he's done a good job of stabilizing the non-Curry minutes. That was his job. That's why they brought him in. But his shooting percentages have been awful too. At a certain point, somebody other than Curry is going to have to put the ball in the basket.
Yeah, no doubt about that. 16 points per game for Clay. He's been steady at about 15 to 18 points pretty much every game, but you just need more than that. You need more juice than that. And their offense has been good off the bench, despite the fact that Chris Paul has not shot the ball well. He's done basically everything else that they've needed. But they're going to need more than that. 20 minutes per game for Jonathan Kuminga, 17 for Moses Moody. Like, those are guys that I thought, hey, these guys could really challenge for some of those minutes and some of that youthful energy that you're talking about here. But that is a concerning thing.
If you just look at the shooting numbers for all those guys you mentioned too, like, and again, like 4 or 5 big shooting nights at this point in the season could change that. But Kuminga's shooting 18% from three. Klay Thompson's less than 35, and I bet league average is probably around 37. Wiggins 15, Chris Paul 16. Like, it's dreadful right
It's
now.
hard to be that bad on a team that has Stephen Curry as your shooting.
And especially like what we've come to know of the Warriors over the last decade or whatever it's been. Like, it's just unusual.
Let's go now to a surprise. I'm going to drop one here. Somebody that a team that I just saw, the Houston Rockets. Houston has been
on my list, Ryan.
Just unbelievable. Just a crazy run for Houston so far. They've won 6 in a row. Just beat the defending champs. Nikola Jokic putting up, unprecedented numbers once again, but it didn't matter because Houston has depth and talent and defense and things that we don't really associate with the Houston Rockets. I just talked with Jackson Gatlin on a Houston Rockets video last week, and it is pretty clear that they are making a change. They're making a radical change there with Ime Udoka, and Fred VanVleet, Dylan Brooks, Alperen Sengun are just doing some crazy things.
They're on my list. I figured they would be better this season. I don't know if you see the thing that I put on Twitter just about every offseason. It's just like, who added the most wins over replacement player from last season over the course of the summer. And I think they may have led that this summer, unsurprisingly. But even then, I thought, okay, a good outcome for the Rockets is going to be like high 30s in wins. I thought, if they get to 38, 39, they can feel good about that. If it looks like there's a culture shift, they're more competitive, great. And they may still end up there by the end of the season. But at this point, I wouldn't be remotely surprised to see them make the playoffs. The way the veterans have fit with the young guys is just seamless. Breaking news, like Dylan Brooks is one of my least favorite players in the league to watch. He's driven me crazy many times over the years. But man, he fits really well there. And he's not going to shoot at 55% from three or whatever he's at for the whole season. But even if he's like mid to high 30s, that's a much different player than he was in Memphis. Like if he has the defensive energy and intensity that he had there, plus like an average to slightly above average 3-point shot, he's a really helpful wing. I've thought Jabari Smith Jr. was a little underrated defensively even last year. And I think he's going to take some steps forward offensively this year. Sengun, you and I follow the Nuggets real closely, so we're kind of accustomed to playmaking bigs. What he can do as a playmaker, I think, is going to open things up for everybody. And the way all the pieces have sort of melded together perfectly here in the first couple of weeks is a big surprise to me. Like, I wouldn't have been surprised if they had looked this good in February or something after like a long learning curve. But their learning curve was apparently like those opening 3 games or whatever that they lost. Like they've just been ridiculous ever since then.
I get to pull on my Nuggets experience here when talking about a team like Houston, because I remember the 2017 offseason when Denver signed Paul Millsap. And
huge,
you just get a nice veteran that fits into the building where you have a bunch of young talent. And it's maybe a little bit directionless at some points, but you get somebody in who understands how to put things together. And I think that the comparisons between Jokic and Sengun in their third seasons, they're pretty close. I think they are. It's just, and I know that it was probably harder for Jokic specifically, kind of in that time where Jokic just kind of opened up the door for teams to be willing to try this with young bigs. And he's kind of been the focal point where his 18, 10, and 6 is probably a little more valuable than Sengun's 18, 10, and 6 now or whatever he's averaging. But it doesn't matter because, frankly, they're doing a lot of the same things. They're playing a lot of the same style. And Sengun's been really impressive on both ends of the floor. I've just been floored, in all honesty, about how he has evolved. Like, I jokingly called him Enes Kanter, but with a passing game. He is
Mhm.
not that. He's just not. Like that was last year when things were going
I was
horribly
just
for
going to ask
Houston.
you, was that last season?
Yes, that was last season. That was not this season, fortunately. And don't tell Rockets fans that I ever said that because they were very unhappy. But
I
no,
was
he's a star.
I was high on him last season too. And a lot of the numbers that I would kind of look up over the course of the season would make me think, man, they should really be playing through this guy a little bit more. He did have his defensive shortcomings, and he still does, but I think he's gotten better on that end. There was a video of Fred VanVleet after the Rockets beat the Nuggets, and somebody asked him how Sengun had done on Jokic, and he looked at the stat sheet and laughed and said Jokic had 36, 21, and 11. And that is kind of funny. But I think Jokic shot 13 of 26 from the field in that game. And 50% is a good shooting night. 50% and 36 points is great for most players.
Sure.
That's sort of below Jokic's typical level.
Yeah.
So Sengun really did make him work for a lot of those points. And he really is adapting. I love that he calls Jokic his idol because you can see the elements of Jokic's game in his. He hit that little, I'm not even going to call it a fadeaway. He hit that little lean back jumper on him 2 or 3 times in that game. He's kind of got his own signature shot, kind of like Jokic has the Sombor shuffle. He's got some little flip shots and hook shots around the basket. He's got great footwork. He's got happy feet a lot of times. That's something he'll probably figure out over the course of his career. But the elements are there for him to be like a high level playmaking big.
Also, a couple chase down blocks where he even blocked
That
Jokic pretty early in the first quarter, and he blocked Colin Gillespie at one point. No, he was really impressive, and
the
probably like
Gillespie one really caught my eye. I don't know if I've ever seen a guy sort of coax a player ahead of him into taking the layup the way Sengun did. He totally made it look like he was just going to take the play off.
Yeah.
And then burst on him as soon as Gillespie started to go into his layup. That was clever. I don't know if I've seen that many times.
It is smart to do. LeBron comes to mind with a couple of those chase downs for sure, where he'll just like, especially in his younger years, he'll just like kind of hold up a little bit and time it up and just kind of size it up and
Yeah,
then explode
LeBron's
right to the rim.
LeBron's are timed from like the 3-point line though. Like
Yeah,
that's
fair.
a different animal for sure. But you do have a point. Like he's definitely like planning that out a second or two before it happens. So you're right.
Couple more surprises and disappointments here. I think the Indiana Pacers should be mentioned. They haven't been perfect, and their defense isn't good enough.
That's
But the offense and Tyrese Halliburton is tremendous. He is
it.
unbelievable to watch, and one of my favorite players. And I think an outside chance candidate for most improved player this year. But I'm going to probably give it to one of the other guys that we talked about. We'll talk about that in the next segment. But Tyrese Halliburton, awesome.
Funny you mentioned them because that's another team on my list of surprises, and I specifically wrote Pacers offense, not just the Pacers. Another one that I think I figured they'd be competitive. I've really liked for all of last season too when they played Halliburton with Buddy Hield. I think him with shooting is just a recipe for success. But for them to average like I don't even know what they're at now, 122, 123 points per 100 possessions, just scoring at an absurd rate. He's got to be in the conversation for best point guard through 10 games. Obviously, Stephen Curry's there. There's a Luka Doncic, if we want to call him a point guard. But what Halliburton is doing is obviously absurd. This is like a fully realized Rick Carlisle offense now. It took a couple of years for it to get going, but this wouldn't be the first time that he had the best offensive rating in league history. At least I don't think so. I know that he had the record for some portion of his season with Dallas. I don't know if he finished there. But obviously a great offensive coach. It's working. There's tons of shooting around him, around Halliburton, I mean. And that offense has just been a blast to watch.
It is a blast, and they get up and down. The spacing that they have with playing so many smaller guys and then playing Miles Turner who can roll and pop, that is a big deal. Obi Toppin still trying to figure some stuff out, obviously, but he is tailor made for that offense and the way that they want to play.
Yep.
Just because he can also be the guy who rolls in that situation, and Halliburton will never miss him. He is a guy that sees everything, and that's a great trait to have because you roll and you cut harder in a lot of situations when you know you're not going to be missed. And Halliburton is like he's turned himself into one of the premier playmakers in the NBA. Like if we're being honest, like that is a very high bar, but he is one of the 3 to 5 best passers now.
Yeah, I would, without like writing out a list right now, I'd say I'd have him in that top 3 to 5 playmaker range too. He's just been absurd here out of the box.
2 disappointments for you. Clippers and Lakers. Although we should probably talk about the Timberwolves being positive as well. There's just so many teams that we could get into in this segment.
Yeah.
But like which direction would you like to go?
I could talk about any of those 3 teams. Maybe I'll just do like real quick hits for you. The Timberwolves, I think having the number 1 defense is a little bit of a surprise.
Yeah.
The Cat Gobert thing didn't work great last year, obviously, but having followed Gobert fairly closely when he was with the Jazz, maybe I shouldn't be all that surprised because he was the backbone of some really good defenses there, and they didn't have a lot of great perimeter defenders on most of those teams. Now he's got Jaden McDaniels and Anthony Edwards, and they look like a beast defensively. And then the Lakers, I don't know if I'm surprised by their mediocrity, to be honest with you. The Gabe Vincent pickup I thought was wildly overhyped. Christian Wood has obviously had his issues at various stops during his NBA career. I feel like they just shuffled a lot of below average role players for more below average role players.
There's a meme in there somewhere that should be discussed about, hey, this is
maybe
the same picture, the same exact picture as last year. Where hey, probably makes sense that it feels a lot the same.
Yeah, and then obviously they were really good in the second half of last year and in the playoffs. So Lakers fans have that to fall back on. But in the back of my head, I always kind of felt like they were more like the team in the middle of the season than they were against the Grizzlies in the playoffs or the Warriors in the playoffs. And maybe that's not fair. That's just kind of been my take. And LeBron, he's doing things we have never, ever, ever seen in a 21st season and probably never will again. But he's pushing 40 now. And Anthony Davis is going to miss games every, 5 or 6. So there are definite weaknesses to exploit with the Lakers. And one more, the Clippers, worse than I thought they would be, to be quite honest with you. I could have seen how the James Harden thing would go poorly. They look atrocious, which is not something I expected.
I did a rant on the Clippers on the Alley YouTube. If anybody wants to go check that out for more extended thoughts on what that looks like and how disappointing they have been, go check that out. But this is just a monstrosity. It's horrible, and they deserve all of the criticism at this point for putting all of their eggs in a basket that they did not need to put it in, and no wonder it has turned out badly.
Yeah, this is another one where maybe I shouldn't be surprised. I was like cautiously optimistic. I thought he just helped Embiid get the MVP. He's averaged 20 and 10 in each of the last 3 seasons. Like maybe he's willing to defer to Kawhi and Paul George. Having said that, when I saw what they paid to get him, I did think, gosh, that's a lot. Like why would you give up all that for him if you're the only bidder? But man, the puzzle pieces clearly do not fit right now, and somebody's going to have to radically change the way that they play, or Ty Lue's going to have to bring one of them off the bench. And even then, through 4 games, I'm like, is it salvageable? Like they have looked awful.
You know who I'm not disappointed in on that team? Russell Westbrook. Like, honestly, I think he's done just about as well as anybody could expect in his situation. He has tried to adapt his game. He's trying hard. He's one guy on that team that you're never going to question his effort and his willingness to kind of fit into that situation. He's had to make several changes throughout his career and has been much, like I think, villainized for different roles that he has played, and he's played his own like issues into that. I don't want to minimize that, but the dude is trying, and he's one of the only guys that I see being willing to do some of the hard stuff. Nobody else is willing to do the hard things, and that's what happens when you give up Marcus Morris, KJ Martin, Robert Covington, Nicholas Batum as four of your connecting pieces. You have no connectors anymore. It's just like, clearly this was going to be a problem, and I have no idea what in the world they were thinking with that deal.
Again, I can kind of see the logic, but I also saw the downside. Like it was a massive risk, and it's clear now why people like you were so down on it in the first place.
And yeah, I mean, this could absolutely turn around, and they make a trade or two, and they try to bolster the rest of their team. And hell, even if Mason Plumlee comes back, then they might have just another guy that's willing to kind of do the hard stuff. But is anybody really considering this team good enough defensively in order to actually compete with anybody?
Yeah, I certainly wouldn't put them in the contenders tier. They're going to have to look dramatically different at some point this season for me to think they have a prayer against. Denver, Dallas looks really good. Like, there are teams in the West that are not going to have a problem with them.
Not at all. Well, good stuff. Really good stuff on surprises and disappointments. Is there any team that you feel like we haven't hit that needs to be discussed here?
I'll be really, really brief. It's funny. We had a lot of overlap in our surprises and disappointments, but I'll just mention the Pelicans.
Yeah, that's true.
They get a little bit of a pass because injuries always seem to wreck the Pelicans, and CJ McCollum has the freak thing with his lung again. That's awful, and they're missing a lot of guys. But Zion Williamson doesn't look anywhere near what he did in his first few seasons in the NBA. He doesn't look as explosive. His numbers have fallen off a cliff this season. So they're a team I'm kind of paying attention to after a 4-1 start. They're just, I think they might even be below 500 now. So they've been a bit of a disappointment to me. And then this one might surprise people. I thought the Wizards would at least be competitive. Like, I thought Tyus Jones has been such a good backup point guard for all those years in Memphis. Now he finally gets a chance to start. Kuzma's at least like, he's a legitimate NBA role player.
He's a good player. Yeah.
Right. They've got a few wings that are interesting in Avdia and Kispert, and Jordan Poole's going to have nights where he goes for 40, and it's just not working at all. Like, they were beating the Raptors all night tonight, and then they gave that one up too. I think they're 2-7, 2-8 or something
kidding.
at this point.
They
were winning that whole game.
Oh my God. They were
Jordan Poole.
You don't understand. They were winning 106-90, and they finished with 107.
Yeah, it's mind blowing. I don't know how that happened. I looked this up the other day. Jordan Poole is taking less shots per game this season than he did with the Warriors, which kind of blew my mind. Like nothing is working for the Wizards right now, and I wouldn't have picked them to make the playoffs or anything, but I thought they would be like a tough out at least, and maybe guys like Kuzma would play himself into some decent trade value or something, and they look like they could have the worst record in the league.
Oh, I mean, there's no doubt that they probably should have the worst record in the league. I do think that maybe Detroit will have something to say about that, but it has been, man. That clip that came out of Jordan Poole of just like not paying attention in the timeout and like doing everything.
I might have missed that one.
Oh yeah, that just came out today. You should go look at that.
Okay, yeah, I'll check that out.
It's basically him doing everything but paying attention to the timeout and just kind of making a fool of himself because he's caught on camera doing all this other stuff, like laughing about stuff, throwing towels, not paying attention, yelling at people, like not even really paying attention to the play. And then it's just, that dude needs some extra stuff.
I actually spoke to someone with the Warriors the other day, and I got the sense that there was some remorse about what happened with Jordan Poole last season, as you might expect, with the Draymond punch and him just kind of being thrown under the bus for an entire season.
Yeah.
And he said Jordan's a good kid, but he needs to grow up. So I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah. I don't think he's going to grow up in Washington, man. I just don't.
May not. So, yeah, there's something about Washington. That was my I used to live in Virginia. Boy, it's been 10, 15 years ago now. So that was like my regional sports network team.
Yeah.
And that's when they had Nick Young and JaVale McGee. And
what a throwback. Oh, my God.
There is something about Washington and having players who may need to do a little maturing.
Yeah, they need a culture shift for sure. All right. Well, hey, that was our surprises and disappointments, everybody. If you're watching this on YouTube, make sure to go hit the like and subscribe button on the channel. Would really tremendously appreciate that. Trying to grow this from the ground up, and I think it's been pretty successful so far. So get on board on the ground floor if you can. It's only going up from here. When we come back, we're going to chat about early awards picks and just a variety of things that we can get into, and maybe some Nikola Jokic. We'll talk about that in just a second. And we're back here at the Alley-Oop. Please like and subscribe to the YouTube channel if you can. Joined by Andy Bailey for those that didn't see the previous video, or if you're listening to the same podcast on the audio feed. I'll make sure to like and follow and rate and review on all that stuff as well. That would be tremendously helpful for sure. All right, Andy, let's do early awards picks for this season. Only 10 games in, and these, I think, will probably more set the table for what is to come throughout the year. I mean, we've had some times where Steph Curry or Kevin Durant was the early MVP candidate in the last couple of years, and it became Jokic, or it became Embiid, and these things can obviously change and shift. But through 10 games, I want to know who your MVP is to start the season.
Sure, and generally speaking, I would hate to predict who the MVP might be after 10 games. I think given what we've seen from Jokic, maybe that is a little more safe than it is in other years.
Yeah, fair.
But I kind of looked at this as if the league just handed out MVP through the first, like, who was the MVP of these 10 games? It's got to be Jokic. I mean, we've seen some absurd stat lines from Luka and Stephen Curry, Maxey, Embiid. Like, there have been some really, really, really high level performances. But I've been covering the NBA for 13 years now. I've been watching it for probably 30. I don't know if I've ever seen anybody who controls the game the way that Jokic does. He's scoring like a I don't even know how to describe it. I mean, like 30 points on close to 70% true shooting is unfathomable. And that's what he's doing. But he also controls the game as a passer. Obviously, when he doesn't have the ball, he's directing people around the floor, offensively and defensively. He's a one-man wrecking crew on the boards this season. He's leading the league in rebounds per game. I wouldn't even know how to look this up, but I can't imagine many people in the history of basketball were top 5 in points per game, rebounds per game, and assists per game. That's what he's doing right now. I would think maybe a couple of those Russell Westbrook triple-double seasons might be close to there. Oscar Robertson was probably close to there.
Sure.
But it's crazy what he's doing right now. And a lot of it's been without Jamal Murray. Again, like, he's far and away to me the MVP of the first 10 games. And that's even with, like I said, some outrageous performances from other guys around the league.
The consistency with him, I think, really stands out. The stat that I think kind of underscores that, he's at 20 points and 10 rebounds in 10 straight games. Like, that's the most in NBA history. like most in NBA history. Like that just happened. And by the way, he culminated that in this last game. It was a loss to the Houston Rockets, the aforementioned Houston Rockets, but 36, 21, and 11. I looked that up, and other guys have been close to that, but when I plugged in 36, 21, and 11 into StatHead, the last performance that happened like that, 55 years ago by Wilt Chamberlain in the regular season. Playoffs, I think Kareem did it I want to say Kareem did it in 1970 during the Milwaukee Bucks run. But like, I mean, come on, man. It's just,
which is also 50 plus years ago.
Yeah, exactly. So like, what are we really doing here? It is unbelievable to watch. 8-2 record for the Nuggets. So you can't just make the argument that he's putting up good stats on a mediocre or bad team. He is driving winning, and the Nuggets have the 8th ranked defense on cleaning the glass, I believe. So it's not like he hasn't been able to help them defensively either. I think he's been perfectly fine on the defensive end to start this year, and there hasn't really been a storyline about the defense for Denver. If anything, the defense has been strongly positive for the Nuggets at the beginning.
I was just going to say the same thing. Like if you had to try and find something that's different about him, because we've seen him play at an outrageous level for at least the 3 seasons prior to this one, and now obviously these first 10 games. He does look a little bit more engaged defensively than he has in previous regular seasons. He looks more like playoff Jokic on the defensive end in this early part of the season, which I think is different. And I got a ton of crap for this at the time. And if I talked about it again on Twitter, I'm sure I'd get crap for it again. But I always thought he could be like a Marc Gasol type of defender. Probably would never be like quite the rim protector Gasol was, but he's massive. He's typically in the right spots defensively. He has very, very quick hands. He is a dominant defensive rebounder. He can have a real impact defensively, and I think we're seeing that this season. And if he's locked in on both ends of the floor for the whole campaign or even most of it, I don't see how they're going to give it to somebody else, especially given what happened after last year's MVP race, as toxic as that got. For him to follow up his second place finish with the postseason that he had, he just left no doubt that this is clearly the best player in the world right now.
Definitely a mea culpa for voters probably incoming here. There is a feeling, I think, that a lot of people owe it to him to make up for a past wrong. And that may not bear out, and maybe somebody else steps up and proves that they are a better candidate this year. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. I didn't really have another guy that stood out as a worthy challenger as of yet. But Luka Doncic, 8-2 record as well for Dallas Mavericks. And who are you going to give the MVP to on the Philadelphia 76ers? Is it Tyrese Maxey or Joel Embiid?
Well, you know what's funny is, do you ever check the MVP tracker on Basketball Reference?
I do, and I actually saw this graphic that you're about to talk about.
Yeah, Embiid was second, right?
Mm-hmm.
So whatever model they use, it's based on previous voting results, and right now Maxey is third. So that just underscores your point. Like he's been ridiculous. I think the Sixers have the best record in the league, and those two guys could end up like splitting some votes. We've seen that in the past. The best team has 2 superstars, and they kind of cancel each other out. So that's certainly possible. I don't think anybody's like a great challenger to Jokic right now, but I did write down Luka too. Dallas is off to a really good start, and he's had some absurd scoring nights. I think the night that he had 44, he was 17 of 21 from the field.
Disgusting. Just tremendously good.
His 3-pointer looks more locked in. He's done a really good job of sort of allowing Kyrie Irving to get up and running there. I think he's empowered new guys like Grant Williams. So he's done really well. And then we talked about them in the earlier segment, the Warriors. The fact that they have a winning record with everybody playing as poorly as they are, I think Stephen Curry at least has to be in the conversation.
I think for sure there's no doubt that he's a for the conversation kind of guy, like a part of the conversation kind of guy, and we'll see whether he can really cross into that. I think they probably still have to win about 50 games in order to to
Right.
seriously challenge there. But I mean, Steph is Steph. Like there's no doubt about it. Let's move to Defensive Player of the Year. I think that this might be kind of a similar case where there's probably one guy that I'd guess that you have really above the others right now early on in these 10 games.
Well, I hope I don't disappoint you. The second and third names I wrote down, I think, are a little more off the wall, but my leader right now is Gobert. Um, like we mentioned before, Minnesota has the best defense in the league, and I think their perimeter defense deserves a lot of credit for that. Edwards and McDaniels are really good perimeter defenders. I think Kyle Anderson is a really underrated defender, but Gobert is back to looking sort of like a defensive system, like he did with the Utah Jazz. He covers so much ground around the paint. I've always thought he's better on switches on the perimeter than people give him credit for. Everybody's going to point to the low light reels when he gets dusted by somebody like Stephen Curry. But for a 7-1 guy, he's pretty good on the outside. I don't think anybody tracks this, but he's got to be among the league leaders every year in opposing drivers seeing him in the paint and just realizing he's there and doing a U-turn and going somewhere else. I did an article about him 4 or 5 years ago where I got to talk to the Jazz general manager, Dennis Lindsey, and he said, one of the things about Rudy Gobert that's so impactful, a lot of what he does is prevent actions. So nothing gets recorded in a stat sheet. He just prevents so much from happening with his size and his timing, and he's back to that kind of player. So he would be my pick right now.
Yeah, Gobert's definitely my pick as well. He has been unbelievable to start the year, as you mentioned. Teams are shooting 47.87 EFG against Minnesota right now, which is it's insane.
Crazy.
Average for that is about 53% most years. And he has really been a big factor in making sure the teams can't get anywhere close to the rim. I watched them against the Denver Nuggets, one of the best offenses in the NBA, and he was dynamic in how he shut them down. And a team like Denver that wants to go towards the rim in pretty much everything that they do, he blocked everything up. And obviously Jaden McDaniels does get some credit for that. And I do think that there is an interesting kind of dynamic. You remember when the Sixers were the number one defense or very close to it with Simmons and Embiid, and it's hard kind of to parse credit between those two, where Simmons was the main perimeter versatile guy who a lot of teams, like, and he was the one who got all the Defensive Player of the Year buzz one year where Gobert still won it. But Embiid was the guy who all the impact metrics loved and all the on-off data loved for sure. I'm not sure how to parse that sometimes, because when you talk to like NBA teams, they know that both are necessary. It's not about really one versus the other in terms of creating a defensive identity like that, but it's probably harder to recreate what Gobert's done so far than what McDaniels has done so far, just because you can switch off on different defensive perimeter guys, and it's really hard to make up for lack of rim protection.
Yeah, I totally agree with all that. I always sort of default to rim protector being the most important, but you saw some series like the infamous Clippers series when he was with the Jazz. I can't remember. I can't remember if they had a series lead or not, but eventually they get burned by Terrence Mann in whatever game that was. And it was because there was no containment on the perimeter. And suddenly Rudy Gobert's got to guard like 3 or 4 people on the back line, possession after possession. So rim protection is incredibly important. It can be neutralized if you don't have perimeter defenders. So it's sort of a balancing deal there.
Oh, both are important. And like Jaden McDaniels should absolutely be a first team all defense guy. If I'm doing,
he's been ridiculous.
Kind of
yeah,
he's unbelievable. And like moving your feet at that size, at that effectiveness, and like getting into guys and then making their lives hell is still a very important part of this. So I think like you mentioned, the point of attack defense is important in making sure that the rim protection matters. And it's probably the biggest reason why they're the number one team right now is they've got both. They don't have one or the other, and they aren't like you don't have to figure out which one is more valuable because they've got both.
Right. That's a good way to put it.
Any other DPOY candidates for you?
Like I said, these might be a little weird. I've always thought Jason Tatum's defense was kind of underrated, and Boston is number 2 defensively right now. I think the easy pick that most people would make for that is either Derek White or Drew Holiday, and they've both been really good defensively. But I think Tatum has a little bit of what you just talked about with Jaden McDaniels, where he's really big and he moves his feet very, very well. He's a good positional defender. I actually thought the year that Marcus Smart won Defensive Player of the Year that Tatum may have had just as good or if not better case than he did. Sure. So he's long been a guy who I've thought is underrated defensively, and I just thought, well, they're second in defense. Maybe I'll give a nod to Tatum. And then the third one, I mentioned he's not a personal favorite of mine, but Dylan Brooks has been kind of a culture changer for the Rockets defense. They're a team that is definitely more reliant. We just had this discussion of perimeter defense versus rim protection. And even though Sengun has gotten better defensively, their defensive strength is certainly on the perimeter, and I think Dylan Brooks has a ton to do with that.
Absolutely. Hard to argue after seeing what he did versus Denver last game. And he just looks great. He looks like he found a home here, and like he's bringing the best things about the Memphis Grizzlies to a team like the Houston Rockets, and not kind of leaving the rest of the stuff behind. At least
I agree with that.
Point. There are still some antics. There's still some things you kind of raise an eyebrow at eventually, and then that may burn them down the line. But through 10 games, I think it's a very fair pick.
Yeah, I agree with all that.
Let's go to most improved player. I think this for me, this was a pretty easy call based off of the previous conversations that we had. Tyrese Maxey, the numbers that we just saw him put together: 28 points, 7 assists, 5 rebounds, 50, 43, 90 splits as a shooter.
That's outrageous.
That's disgusting, and they are MVP caliber numbers, as we mentioned in the previous segment. I am very high on Tyrese Maxey. I was high on him initially. I never thought he could get to this level, but he has.
Yeah, he's my top pick too, and there's obviously a lot of time for his numbers to come down to earth a little bit. I've always liked Tyrese Maxey too, especially in the playoffs. Like when there were those moments over the last couple of years where it looked like everybody else on the Sixers was breaking down. Maxey never really seemed to. He seems like a guy who kind of has that. He has that it factor that allows him to rise to the moment in the playoffs.
That dog in him, if you will.
There you go. But even with my optimistic perception of him would have been 23, 24 points would be his ceiling per game, maybe 5, 6 assists. If he maintains 29 and 7 for the whole season, that's potentially altering the landscape of the NBA. There's your all-star, all-NBA running mate for Joel Embiid, and that makes them a contender again, I think. So he's the easy pick for me too. I think he's starting to run away with the odds in the books as well, not surprisingly. It's going to be hard to pick against him if he keeps this up.
He just meets the exact profile that you're looking for. A young guy that has an expanded role, that is also better, that is in a high-profile situation and goes from kind of a borderline star to a clear star. And that's how the MIP has really sort of broken down over the course of the last few years. Other guys I considered: Alperen Sengun, Tyrese Halliburton, Scotty Barnes. I think all three of those guys should probably get some consideration. Just young guys that are really figuring things out in their situations. But Maxey's my runaway.
Maxey's my runaway too. The other two names that I had listed, you just mentioned, Sengun and Scotty Barnes, both of whom I think have taken pretty legitimate steps forward this season, just not quite the leap that Maxey has.
Yeah, and Halliburton I might be overstepping on, but he's borderline MVP candidate to me too. So I was just
he could be in the mix for sure. Yeah,
let's just throw him in there because he's leading the best offense in the league. 23 and 12, and the efficiency with him is just nutso as well. So, and
Crazy.
the other thing about Halliburton, and Maxey also has this too, neither of those guys turned the ball over, which is such an underrated skill where they're just not making mistakes. And if you're getting shots up or you're setting people up consistently and you're not turning it over, you are so much more valuable than people mostly give credit for.
Yeah, totally agree.
Let's go to Rookie of the Year now. I thought that this was a two-man race initially, but I didn't necessarily delve too deeply into this. I'm curious to where you want to go on this.
I didn't go too deep on this one either. I think there's I think I could very easily argue for Chet Holmgren as the Rookie of the Year through 10 games, 9 games, or whatever OKC has played. If I had to make a prediction for who's going to win it, I'd still go with Wembanyama. And I might still go with him for the first 10 games thing for the same reason I probably would have gone with Banchero last year. There were rookies who had better, like significantly better impact numbers than Banchero last season. Everybody freaked out about the Walker Kessler vote, but impact-wise, he was really, really good. Jalen Williams is another guy who had better impact numbers than Banchero. But Banchero had this, huge responsibility on offense for the Magic.
Sure.
And I think Wembanyama has this huge responsibility on both sides of the floor for San Antonio. And he's still putting up crazy numbers. I think his impact numbers would look better if they would knock off the Jeremy Sohan at point guard experiment. I understand what they're doing with that, but I think San Antonio could be competitive right now if they would just play Wembanyama with a real point guard, and they have one in Trey Jones. So that's my long-winded way of saying I'm going to go with Wembanyama here, but there's a real argument for Chet.
The thing that I wrote down, because I had both names too, I wrote Wemby versus Chet. I wrote Wemby for the impact within the situation, and Chet for the statistical impact.
There you go.
I think that is the way to frame this, at least in the first 10 games, where any number is going to tell you that Wemby has not been as good as Chet, just from the impact metrics and everything, where Wemby's situation, he is turning the ball over more, he's being asked to do more, he has a 30% usage rate. What are we doing? That is a rookie holding a 30% usage rate with all the pressure that he already has on him. LeBron doesn't do. He didn't do that.
And having to be all of their defense. He's more than just the backline rim protector. I mean, they're having him guard fours in a lot of these games. So he's got a ton of responsibility. And the other thing I should have mentioned about Chet too is, of course, his impact numbers are going to be better. He's playing off of Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, Jalen Williams, Josh Giddey to a degree. He has guys absolutely making his life easier.
Lou Dort's been really good for them too. They have a situation where all you needed was a 5-man, and they found a competent one in Chet. That is underselling Chet a little bit, and I think that he's going to be great. But I think that Wemby is. I think I would go with Wemby right now, because Rookie of the Year, you don't necessarily have to go with the most impactful rookie. You have to go with. I think there is some level of future value that you're trying to get with an award like this, and projection with an award like this that is just a little bit different than some of the others. So I would probably go Wemby, and just understanding that his situation is far worse than Chet's. But I mean, shout out to Chet Holmgren for putting up identical numbers in a lot of ways to Victor Wembanyama, the most hyped rookie we've ever seen.
Yeah, Chet's been really, really good. Yeah, I agree with everything you said there.
Where do you want to go with some other awards? Do you have any others that you're very focused on right now?
Not super focused, and peek behind the curtain, we kind of talked about not talking about Sixth Man of the Year before we started, but I will just say, and I already mentioned him at some point in this podcast, I would love for 1 year for Sixth Man of the Year to not go to just one of the top scorers off the bench, because that's been the tradition for so long. I think Kyle Anderson is just an awesome basketball player. I have loved him since his days at UCLA, and I think he has a lot to do with how good the Timberwolves have been. out of the gate, and he's not going to get any Six Man of the Year buzz as we go through this season because he's going to average 7 or 8 points. He's not going to have like highlight dunks, but he guards a bunch of different positions. He can run the offense. He can hit a three if he's wide open. I think he's just a phenomenal connector. He can connect with the starters. He can connect with the bench. He's a guy that I think at least deserves a mention if we're going to bring up Six Man of the Year.
Shout out Kyle Anderson. Shout out to Chris Paul in that potential discussion as well, where
Sure.
like we've talked about how in the hell the Warriors have been are surviving. A lot of it is because of Steph Curry, but a lot of it is because their bench is actually winning their minutes and Chris Paul's helping win their minutes. So, and with that situation where nobody's really shooting well and they're still finding ways to get it done, then I think that he deserves some credit there too. But in a lot of the same ways as a cerebral player, although I'm not going to lie, the diving into Mike Conley's knee sort of rubbed me the wrong way.
Yeah, he has all the flopping and the extra stuff, and then dirty plays like that has always been difficult for me with Chris Paul. Obviously, one of the greatest point guards of all time, first ballot Hall of Famer, but stuff like that drives me nuts. Aside, I posted that video. I just like quote tweeted somebody, and Rudy Gobert liked it, which I thought was funny. One of Conley's teammates liking a post calling a current NBA player one of the dirtiest of all time was a little eye opening.
It's true though.
But I would guess he's not the only current NBA player who might agree with that assertion.
Look, there is a reason why every team in the NBA was cackling at the Phoenix Suns' downfall the last 2 years.
And he's been, with the exception of that 1 year in OKC, like somehow I don't know if it was just because they were an underdog for so long or he actually like reined in some of that extra stuff that season. Like I found him and that team pretty likable.
Yeah.
Some of his early Hornets teams I thought were cool, like when he played with Peja and David West and those guys. But a lot of what he's done is tough over the course of his career.
You know what? Screw it. We're going with Kyle Anderson. Kyle Anderson, you are the Sixth Man of the Year. We will not be taking any other submissions at this time. All right, 2 more here before we wrap up then. Let's go with best team and worst team that you've seen so far.
I'm going to go with the Nuggets for best team. I think there's a strong case for the Celtics. I think there's a strong case for the 76ers. From what I've seen from the fully healthy Nuggets, and it may be a bit before we see them again, I think they'll probably be understandably cautious with Jamal Murray's timeline. When they're all together, that is such a well-oiled machine that checks so many boxes. All those guys know how to play with each other really well. Denver's bench has looked pretty bad the last couple games, but I think a big part of that is just thrown out of whack because Murray was the one leading that second unit in the early part of the season. So I think it'll look good again once he comes back. So with the caveat that I'm thinking of like a fully healthy team, the 8-2 Nuggets I think are my pick right now.
I think they're my pick too. I wrote them down, but I do think that the Celtics and the Sixers, like the Celtics have lost 2 games by like a combined 4 points, 5 points. So
the Celtics roster, I think the Celtics, like there's an argument they have a better top 6 than anybody else in the league. Like they are built so well. I would pick Denver in a series still because I think the rosters are close enough that I would just default to who has the best player, and that's Jokic. But Boston's legit, and so are the Sixers.
Yeah, 100% on both of those teams. I do think that it is the Nuggets for the reasons that you've stated, but I mean, if anybody wants to say the Celtics or the Sixers, I'm not going to get an argument out of me right now. Worst team that I've seen so far is the Pistons. It's unfortunate, but I think that you could also make an argument for the Wizards. You could also make an argument for maybe the Hornets at times. Like they look incapable in a lot of ways. But for me, the Pistons, I don't know what's going on with the Jaden Ivey situation. Why don't just start Jaden Ivey what are you doing? Like you have Cade Cunningham and Jaden Ivey and Asar Thompson. Just start those guys. Start them next to a big man, and then find your ideal stretch four. That would be my just pleading to the Pistons at some point. Please just make it easier on yourselves and just commit to a spacing system and get some scoring in there to help out Cade.
Maybe that'll happen. I don't even know what is Bojan Bogdanovic dealing with.
You know what? That's a great question. I was, when I said stretch four, like his name immediately comes to mind because he's on the roster. Like, what's going on?
And that's what he was. I just looked him up. He's got a calf injury. It says he's out for a few more weeks. So I think that will help. I think at some point Cade Cunningham is going to have to start making some shots. Another stat that I looked up in the last couple of days, over the course of his career, among players who've taken at least as many shots for him, he's dead last in effective field goal percentage. And he's got a big offensive responsibility too, so he gets a little bit of a pass for that. But after 3 years, it's fair to wonder, like, is he going to start making some shots? I think my worst team would probably be Washington, but I just looked up just now, like, who has the worst net rating just to see. It's kind of surprising that on Cleaning the Glass, so like the filtered out garbage time, the New Orleans Pelicans are dead last, which I mentioned them as a disappointment earlier. I didn't even realize that when I mentioned them, that they've been worse than I even realized. I certainly wouldn't say that they're the worst team in the league just because there's so much talent on that roster, and I think they're going to figure some things out over the course of the season. But that was a little surprising. If I had to settle on a worst team right now, I'd go Washington. I think Portland is going to get back in that mix once Scoot Henderson gets healthy. Charlotte could be in that mix. They seem kind of rudderless right now. Like, LaMelo's been good the last few games, but they're going to be in the mix for a real high lottery pick.
Yeah, I mean, all great candidates, to be clear. We'll see whether that plays out and whether some of these teams can get out of these early season ruts, or if they are just as bad as we think they will be. I think with Washington, like that's probably the easy candidate to say, yeah, this is going to be a pretty large staple of their season, going 2-8 over the course of 10 games. Like, that's sounds about right. But hey, I mean, see what Detroit does. They're a team for bounce back candidacy. The Pelicans, like you said, I mean, I know that they've dealt with injuries. They should not be this bad. There's no reason. Like, they've got too much talent to be that bad. So they're a team I'll be watching closely as well.
Totally agree with all that. Yep.
All right. Well, Andy, I think that is going to do it for this episode of the Alley-Oop. You've been tremendous as a guest. I really do appreciate it. Where can the people find your lovely work?
Well, I spend way too much time on Twitter/X, so they can find me at Andrew D. Bailey there. I'm also, if you have the Bleacher Report app, I'm sure you see me every once in a while. I do the power rankings every week, and I'll have articles pop up here and there. So that's where you can find me. Good stuff. He is Andy Bailey. Make sure to go check his stuff out. And I mean, you've probably already followed him, if we're being honest, especially if you know me. But if you know of Andy, you know he is a Jokic truther among us Jokic truthers. So thank you so much for hopping on, man. Really appreciate it. And everybody else, we'll talk to you guys in a few days. All right, everybody, that is going to do it for this episode of the Alley-Oop. Thank you so much to Andy for popping by. Really appreciate his insight. Make sure to go check out all of his work, as I mentioned at the end of the episode. Does awesome stuff for Bleacher Report and is always providing great, interesting, insightful statistics on the NBA and just general takes on the NBA, and is one of the most plugged in folks from around the league. Next up on Friday, we are going to have a conversation with the Central Division. Got Milwaukee, Indiana, Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit. Looking forward to being able to talk to some of those folks, get their perspectives on what's happening on ground level.
Don't forget to follow the podcast for every Tuesday and Friday. We've come out with awesome episodes talking about the entire NBA and having honest discussions about the NBA. None of the shenanigans that you're going to get from other places. We're just having good, honest basketball talk. Thank you so much for tuning into the show. Talk to you guys on Friday.